Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. 8 seconds. That's all it will take for the walls around your reality to crack. 8 seconds, before you begin to sense the presence that has been following him, and the reason it might soon follow you. It started with a secret he was never supposed to touch. Not a relic, not a ritual, a memory, buried under centuries of lies and rewritten truths, the kind of truth powerful men have killed to protect. He didn't go looking for it. That's what people never understand. Sometimes the forbidden doesn't lure you. Sometimes it chooses you. He said the moment he found the manuscript, the room changed. Not colder, not darker, but heavier, like the air had become aware of him. He felt something watching, breathing, leaning in, as if the pages themselves were alive, waiting for someone foolish enough to hear what they had been whispering for 600 years. The manuscript told a story that should have died with the ancient order that wrote it. A story about a woman erased from every archive, every chronicle, every ritual text, not by accident, but by design. They called her the unspoken matron, a guardian of knowledge, and a weapon against anyone who dared misuse it. She was not a ghost. Not exactly. She was a consequence, a shadow that attached itself to men who uncovered truths they were too weak to carry. The moment he deciphered her name, she awakened, not with a scream, but with a breath behind his ear. Soft, slow, like someone waking up in the same room as you. He tried to sleep that night, but her presence pressed against the silence, not tormenting him, studying him, as if measuring whether he deserved what he now knew, as if deciding whether he should live long enough to reveal it, or be swallowed by it like the others. He came to me because he felt watched, followed, pulled into dreams that weren't his. And he was right, because once you interact with forbidden memory, you no longer walk alone. You walk with whatever remembers you. And now, because you're hearing this, she knows your name too. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come as a scream, or a shadow, or a cold and dragging across his spine. It came as a silence that didn't belong in the room. A silence that felt built, constructed, placed there by something with intention. He said he woke up at exactly 3:11 a.m. No alarm, no noise, just a sudden realization that the entire world around him had stopped breathing. The wind outside had frozen. The ticking clock beside him had paused. Even his own heartbeat felt delayed, as if something else were controlling the rhythm of his blood. He tried to sit up, but the air felt thick, almost solid, like a presence was pressing down on the mattress, leaning its weight beside him. And in that suffocating quiet, he felt her, not touching him, not whispering, but waiting, as if she wanted him to acknowledge that she was there. He said he forced himself to move, to turn his head, to look into the corner of the room where the darkness always seemed heavier. And that's when he saw her, not fully, not clearly, but as a distortion, a ripple in the blackness, like the darkness had a pulse. The outline of a woman, still as a statue, watching with a patience older than his bloodline. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She was observant, calculating, the way someone looks at an object that has been misplaced but still holds value. Her presence wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, and that terrified him more than any scream ever could. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened, his voice trapped under the weight of something unseen. She moved then, not physically, but in his mind. A pressure, a thought, a feeling that was not his but was placed inside him like a seed. He didn't hear words, but he understood the message. You opened the memory. Now you carry it. It was not a threat. It was a verdict. For days after, he couldn't escape her. Not at work. Not in the daylight. Not in other people's voices. She was behind reflections that didn't match his movements, in footsteps that echoed after he stopped, in moments where his thoughts felt invaded by something ancient and curious. He realized she wasn't haunting him. She was studying him, testing him, peeling away his assumptions one by one. Because once a forbidden truth attaches itself to a man, it begins remaking him from the inside out, whether he wants it or not. He told me the worst part wasn't seeing her shape in the darkness. The worst part was the familiarity, the feeling that she already knew him better than he knew himself. She moved through his thoughts with the precision of someone reading a book they had memorized centuries ago. She wasn't guessing his fears. She was selecting them. She wasn't searching for weaknesses. She was confirming them. And every time he tried to push her out, she pushed back, not violently, but with a calm, relentless strength that made him feel like he was arguing with an ocean. He realized she wasn't just a spirit tied to the forbidden memory. She was the memory itself, the guardian of a truth so dangerous that it needed a living shadow to protect it. By the fourth night, he stopped sleeping. Not because he didn't want to, but because every time he drifted into unconsciousness, she pulled him deeper than dreams should allow. He found himself walking through corridors that didn't exist in any building on Earth, stone passageways lined with symbols that carved themselves into his mind as he passed them. The walls felt alive, breathing in slow, steady rhythms, like a creature watching him walk through its body. And at the center of it all stood the same figure he saw in his room, the unspoken matron, her face hidden, her form perfectly still, her presence heavier than gravity. She wasn't guiding him. She wasn't warning him. She was preparing him. In those dream places, she showed him fragments, moments erased from history, a council of men burning documents under a hollow moon, a ritual circle collapsing into panic as something they summoned refused to obey, a woman, her face veiled, standing in the ruins of a collapsed order with the stolen truth cradled in her hands. He didn't understand everything he saw, but he understood one thing clearly. The truth she guarded wasn't lost, it was buried. Buried under politics, under religion, under centuries of men who feared the power of knowing too much. When he woke, the symbols from the dream burned behind his eyelids. He could still smell the cold stone. He could still feel her gaze. And he realized something terrifying. She wasn't haunting him because he found the secret. She was haunting him because she wanted to see if he was worthy of carrying it. Because once the forbidden chooses you, you don't escape. You evolve. He told me the moment he truly began to fear for his sanity wasn't when he saw her in the corner of his room, or in the corridors of those impossible dream realms. It was when she followed him into places she should never have been able to enter, places bound by rules, logic, and the waking world. He was driving home at dusk when it happened. The sky was fading into that bruised purple color that always feels like a warning, and the road ahead stretched empty for miles. Then, without explanation, the radio cut out. Not static, not a malfunction, just silence. That same constructed silence he felt at 3:11 a.m. And in the rearview mirror, he saw her, not as a blur or a trick of the fading light, but as a fully-formed silhouette sitting in the back seat, her head tilted slightly, as if she was studying how he breathed. He slammed the brakes, heart pounding, breath shattered, and the car swerved to a stop on the side of the road. When he turned around, the back seat was empty, but the imprint remained, the weight on the cushion, the faint outline of where something had been sitting. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, realizing the terrifying new truth. She was no longer bound to the manuscript or the dreams. She was merging with his perception, weaving herself into the fabric of his reality. She wasn't appearing randomly. She was choosing moments where he was most exposed, physically, mentally, spiritually, testing how much fear he could carry before breaking. That night, when he returned home, the house felt wrong. Not dangerous, expectant. As if every wall, every shadow, every silent corner had been rearranged to observe him better. He walked through the hallway slowly, feeling the air thicken again, feeling that quiet pressure of a presence that knew he was coming before he even entered the door. And on the table in his living room, he found something that stopped him cold. The manuscript. The same manuscript he had locked away. The same manuscript he swore he would never touch again. Except this time, a single page was opened, folded back, positioned perfectly, as if she had selected the next memory for him to see. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The moment he stepped closer, the words began to pulse, not glowing, but shifting, rearranging themselves into a phrase he felt directly in his skull. You are not being haunted. You are being initiated. And for the first time, he understood. She wasn't trying to frighten him. She was preparing him for what the forbidden truth does to a man's soul. He stood over the manuscript, breath trembling, as the meaning of that single phrase carved itself deeper into him. Initiated. Not chosen. Not cursed. Initiated. Like he had stepped into a lineage of men who were never recorded, never honored, never allowed to exist in the pages of history. He told me it felt like the room itself was waiting for his reaction, as if the air had memory and was studying whether he would run or kneel. His hands shook, but he didn't reach for the page. It didn't matter. The knowledge didn't need his permission. It was already inside him, threading itself through his thoughts like roots cracking open the soil of a forgotten grave. The symbols beneath the phrase began to shift again, silently, elegantly, arranging themselves into shapes he had seen only in dreams, shapes he didn't realize he had memorized. Then something inside him snapped, not in fear, but in clarity. He realized she wasn't haunting him because he touched the secret. She was haunting him because he responded to it. Most men would have burned the manuscript the moment they saw the first shadow. Most would have begged for ignorance. But he didn't. He kept reading, kept looking, kept reaching into the dark even when it reached back. She wasn't testing his fear. She was testing his hunger. He said the moment he accepted that, something changed. The pressure in the room didn't vanish, but it shifted, like a door unlocking somewhere behind the walls. The shadows bent slightly, not threateningly, but as if acknowledging him. And for the first time, he felt her not as a haunting presence, but as a force standing beside him, evaluating him with an ancient, merciless tenderness. She wasn't guiding him toward safety. She was guiding him toward transformation. He closed the manuscript gently, but the connection remained, stronger, sharper, cleaner. Over the next hours, memories that weren't his flickered in and out of his vision like reflections on a rippling pond. A ritual chamber buried beneath a forgotten city. Masked elders chanting around a woman veiled in black. A burning library where knowledge screamed as it died. He felt the weight of centuries pressing on him, reshaping him, teaching him without words. By dawn, he knew there was no going back. The forbidden doesn't loosen its grip once it chooses you. It molds you, reforges you, strips away the man you were and replaces him with something carved out of shadow and understanding. And he felt the truth settle inside him like a blade sliding into its sheath. He was no longer running from the secret. He was becoming part of it. He told me the next days were not about fear. They were about awareness. Fear had already been claimed, digested, and discarded by the presence that now walked beside him, invisible but undeniable. What remained was the unsettling clarity of knowing that reality itself was malleable, a canvas, and that he had stepped behind the veil where rules no longer applied. He began noticing the patterns, subtle at first, coincidences that were too precise to be random, shadows that lingered longer than they should, whispers in the wind that repeated words he had not spoken aloud. The world around him was layering itself with meaning, and she was orchestrating every subtle note. It wasn't terror. It was instruction. Every time he tried to articulate what he was seeing, he realized words failed. The forbidden doesn't fit language, it bends it. The manuscript, now resting quietly in his room, became a tool of perception rather than knowledge. He opened it, and the pages no longer contained letters or symbols only. They revealed patterns of intent, traces of manipulation, footprints left by the architects of history who had hidden their actions behind religion, law, and ritual. He could feel their influence like a pulse beneath his skin, and the unspoken matron didn't need to point it out. She made him see. That was the cruelest part. The truth was not taught. It was experienced. It demanded surrender. He started testing boundaries. He walked streets he had known his entire life and noticed alleys and corners that seemed to hum with secrets. Buildings whispered when no one else was present. He realized that the world was built not for comfort or order but for control. Control of perception, control of memory, control of desire. And she was always there, a shadow in the corner of his eye, observing his comprehension deepen. The more he saw, the more she allowed him to see, but always just enough to make him ache for what he couldn't yet grasp. That hunger, he realized, was part of the initiation. Then one evening, he paused in front of his reflection in a shop window. The street was empty. The glass showed his face, but layered over it were glimpses of a presence. A tilt of the head, a shadow brushing his shoulder, eyes that weren't his own. He understood, in that moment, that he was no longer simply himself. He had become a vessel for the forbidden, and she had claimed a part of him to protect the truth from men who would misuse it. His reality, his thoughts, his very identity had shifted imperceptibly, irrevocably. There was no undoing it. He had crossed the threshold, and she had welcomed him, not as prey, but as a witness to the machinery of history hidden in plain sight. He began noticing the signs everywhere. Not obvious signs, the kind most men would call coincidences, but subtle fingerprints of a power he had never acknowledged before. A man dropping a newspaper, the headlines forming patterns he instinctively recognized. A flicker of movement in a cafe that traced the arc of centuries-old manipulations. Streets, monuments, even the placement of statues, they were not random. They were signals. A map for those who could see. And she, the unspoken matron, guided his perception, sharpening it like a whetstone against steel. He no longer walked blindly through the world. Every step, every glance, every heartbeat became a lesson in understanding the hidden currents that shaped human action. She was relentless, patient, and unforgiving, teaching him the language of the invisible. Then came the night that changed everything. He was drawn to an abandoned building at the edge of town. No reason, no impulse, no curiosity he could explain. The street lights flickered as he approached, and the air carried a weight heavier than the night itself. Inside, dust hung like fog, and the walls were lined with symbols carved deep into stone, centuries old. He felt her presence grow stronger, pressing him forward, whispering without sound. And in the center of the room lay an altar, a simple slab of marble, blackened at the edges as though fire had touched it long ago. He understood immediately. This was a nexus point, a place where the hidden past bled into the present. And she had led him here deliberately, to show him the consequences of knowing too much, to show him the machinery that had erased so many who tried to lift the veil before him. He touched the altar lightly, and the room shivered. The air vibrated with a resonance that penetrated his bones. Memories not his own, visions of men and women vanishing, of rituals meant to conceal the unthinkable, of whispers that controlled kingdoms, assailed him. She let him absorb it, allowed him to see the machinery in motion, and then pressed the final truth into him. The forbidden knowledge was not static. It lived. It reacted. It punished the careless and elevated the worthy. And he, now marked by her, had been chosen to carry the weight, to observe, to endure, to comprehend what no ordinary man could ever withstand. His life, his perception, his very identity, had shifted forever. And with that shift came a promise unspoken but clear. Those who crossed this path could never turn back. The days that followed were no longer measured in hours, but in moments of revelation. Every conversation, every shadow, every passing glance became a test. The unspoken matron did not speak. She communicated through presence, through absence, through the subtle pressure of the unseen world pressing against his perception. He could feel her watching, always, waiting to see if he would falter, if he would cling to the comforts of ignorance. And he couldn't. The manuscript had unlocked something in him, a hunger for understanding that no ordinary distraction could satisfy. Knowledge, he realized, was not a gift. It was a responsibility, and with responsibility came weight. A weight that she made him carry consciously, deliberately, so that every thought was sharpened, every impulse measured, every decision observed. He was no longer a man unaware. He was a man accountable to forces older and more intricate than he could have imagined. Then, one night, the manuscript shifted again, opening to a section he swore he had never seen before. Symbols he could not name pulsed on the page, and he felt her presence deepen, settle around him like a cloak woven from shadow and memory. The room seemed to expand, and suddenly he could see the invisible threads connecting people, events, and institutions. Corruption, manipulation, hidden power. It was all visible to him now, all laid bare. The men who claimed to lead nations, the women who dictated belief, the silent architects behind wars, famines, and revolutions. They were puppets, and the strings ran into the hands of the unseen. And she, the guardian, allowed him to see because he had earned the sight, not to act yet, but to understand, to witness, to know. And knowledge, once given, cannot be unlearned. He realized the initiation was not about fear. Fear was merely a doorway. The real trial was endurance, psychological, spiritual, emotional. Could he observe the machinery of the world and remain human? Could he carry the weight of centuries of suppressed truth without breaking? She pressed him further. Shadows would twist unnaturally, symbols would appear in reflections, whispers would lace through streets he walked daily. And when he began to feel the creeping isolation, the subtle alienation from those who lived ordinary lives, he understood that initiation was also a kind of loneliness. The kind that shapes men who are no longer ordinary, who see too much, who know too much, who are marked forever by what has chosen them. By the end of that night, he sat alone in his apartment, the manuscript open before him, and the air thick with presence. He knew something undeniable. The unspoken matron was no longer a watcher on the edges of his life. She had merged with his consciousness. And once a forbidden truth merges with a man, it does not let go. Not ever. He began to notice subtle changes in himself that frightened him more than any shadow or whisper ever could. His thoughts were sharper, but also heavier. Every decision carried a weight he couldn't explain, a gravity that seemed to stretch beyond the immediate, as if history itself were watching him, testing him. He realized he no longer thought like a man living in a world of comfort. He thought like a man who had been exposed to what men were not meant to see, the dark architecture behind human history, the hidden patterns of manipulation, and the invisible forces shaping every hierarchy he had trusted. And she was there at every turn, silent, patient, and relentless, pressing him to notice, to calculate, to understand. Not everyone would survive this clarity. Not everyone should. But he had crossed the line, and she was there to ensure he did not step back. One evening, he was drawn to a library he had walked past dozens of times without noticing its significance. But that night, the doors seemed to open themselves, inviting him in. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ancient ink and dust, a library that existed between worlds. He wandered the aisles, and the books seemed to call to him. Not titles, not authors, but ideas, strategies, truths erased from history. And there she was, standing at the end of a narrow corridor, as if guiding him toward what he needed to see. He didn't move toward her. He simply observed. He understood that this was not about obedience. This was about comprehension. She was not giving him answers. She was forcing him to see the structure behind the lies. And the deeper he looked, the more he understood that every institution, every leader, every narrative he had been taught to trust, had been crafted to control perception, to suppress what she was now revealing to him. By the time he left the library, he realized something profound and terrifying. The world he had known was only a surface. Below it, a network of shadows, memories, and intentions thrived, invisible to ordinary men. She had awakened him to the machinery of reality itself. And with this awakening came a cost. He could no longer trust what he saw with his eyes, hear with his ears, or feel with his heart in the same way again. He had crossed a threshold, and she had guided him through it. Fear was no longer the motivator, understanding was. And the understanding was dangerous, intoxicating, and irreversible. By now, he no longer counted nights or days. He measured his life in revelations. Each moment revealed another layer of the world he had never noticed, another thread in the tapestry of control and manipulation that shaped humanity. Every person he passed became a potential carrier of unseen agendas. Every building, every street, every whisper seemed orchestrated. And she was always there, not as a specter but as a force guiding his perception, pushing him deeper into the patterns that most men were blind to. He could feel the pulse of history, its hidden architects, its suppressed truths, and for the first time, he understood that fear was irrelevant. The danger wasn't in ghosts or shadows. It was in seeing the world as it truly was and realizing there was no going back. He began experimenting, testing the edges of what he could perceive. He walked empty streets at midnight, noting anomalies, reflections that didn't match reality, echoes of footsteps that weren't his, whispers in languages he had never learned. Each observation confirmed the presence of systems operating in the shadows, of forces manipulating history and human behavior with surgical precision. She pressed him further, allowing him to see just enough to understand, never enough to become complacent. And in those moments, he felt the truth sharpen within him. The forbidden knowledge was not passive. It lived. It judged. It rewarded understanding and punished weakness. She was the living embodiment of that judgment. Then came a night when he awoke to the sound of a low vibration in the apartment, subtle yet undeniable. The manuscript lay open on the table, though he had left it closed. Symbols rearranged themselves before his eyes, forming a sequence he recognized from his dreams, a map, a code, a hidden instruction. She had chosen the moment for him to witness it. And in that instant, he realized that initiation was not a process of chance. It was deliberate. She was testing him continuously, shaping his mind, guiding him toward truths so powerful that only a prepared man could endure them. The world, he now understood, was a theater, and he had been selected to see behind the curtains. By dawn, he knew with a chilling clarity, he was no longer the man who had stumbled upon the manuscript. He had become a vessel for forbidden knowledge, a witness to hidden forces, and a participant in a lineage of men who were never documented but whose awareness could alter perception itself. And she, the unspoken matron, was no longer behind him. She was within him. Every choice, every thought, every perception carried her presence and the weight of what he now understood. There was no turning back. The forbidden had claimed him, and he had no choice but to follow its path. The transformation was subtle at first. It began in moments he barely noticed, the way his instincts sharpened, how he could sense manipulations before they were even executed, the way subtle patterns in conversation revealed hidden agendas. Ordinary men operated on surface logic. He operated on layers beneath, guided by her unseen hand. She had become more than a presence. She had become a lens, reframing the world in a language only he could now understand. It was exhilarating and terrifying. Every revelation demanded vigilance. Every insight carried responsibility. And she was relentless, pressing him to comprehend the machinery behind every human action, every institution, every secret hierarchy that governed reality. Then came the test he could not ignore. A stranger approached him in a cafe, a man whose presence radiated control and quiet menace. The air around him seemed deliberately orchestrated, a subtle dominance that few could perceive. But he could. His mind immediately mapped networks of influence, power, and secrecy radiating from this man, and he understood the intent. Someone had noticed him noticing. And she, as always, was there, amplifying his perception, allowing him to read the invisible currents flowing beneath the surface. For the first time, he felt the weight of the forbidden not just in knowledge, but in danger. The world had eyes he could now see, and some of those eyes had been waiting for him. Later that night, he returned to the manuscript. The pages were no longer just symbols, they were living instructions, alive with intent. A series of diagrams outlined movements and manipulations that had shaped generations, secrets buried under centuries of false narratives, rituals performed not for worship but for control, for shaping consciousness itself. She allowed him to see, but she withheld guidance, forcing him to reconcile the enormity of what he understood. He realized the forbidden was not merely knowledge, it was a system, and those who could master it, even partially, could wield power beyond comprehension. But failure was permanent. There was no forgiveness for ignorance in this realm. By the time dawn broke, he knew that he had become part of something vast, something older than any nation, older than any recorded history. She had prepared him for this understanding, and now he bore it fully. To live among men while carrying the machinery of hidden forces was both a gift and a curse, a test that would never end. And as he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he no longer saw just himself. He saw the shadow of the unspoken matron within him, guiding, judging, and reshaping him. The initiation was complete, and there was no turning back. The more he understood, the heavier the burden became. Knowledge, he realized, was not liberating, it was a weight she had placed deliberately upon him. Every revelation about hidden hierarchies, suppressed truths, and the dark currents of power pressed down on his mind, reshaping not just his perception but his very instincts. Ordinary men saw the world as linear, manageable, comforting. He saw it as a labyrinth of manipulation, each tang guided by unseen hands, each action preordained by forces few could perceive. And she, the unspoken matron, had not only shown him the labyrinth, she had made him part of it. Every choice he made now had consequences beyond his comprehension. Every thought, every glance, every interaction was connected to a network that spanned centuries. He tried to step back, to breathe, to regain even a semblance of ordinary life, but it was impossible. The forbidden had claimed him completely. Even in mundane moments, walking down a street, sitting in a cafe, listening to the chatter of strangers, he could see the patterns, the signals, the manipulations. What men called coincidence, he now knew as orchestration. And she, always present, amplified his vision, forcing him to witness the world in ways most could never endure. It was not torment. It was training. And with each observation, he felt himself evolving, sharpening, becoming something other than human, or perhaps something more human than those who chose ignorance. Then came the first confrontation with the consequences of seeing too much. A conversation with a man who seemed ordinary at first, but whose words carried hidden meanings, threats wrapped in civility. He realized in an instant that this man was part of a larger mechanism. Someone sent to probe him, to test whether he could be controlled, misled, or destroyed. And she was there, in the space between perception and comprehension, guiding him, not showing him what to do, but allowing him to see. And seeing was enough, because understanding the machinery is always the first step toward surviving it. Knowledge does not protect you. It sharpens the edge at which life can cut you. By nightfall, he sat alone, the manuscript open, the air thick with her presence. The world outside his window appeared calm, yet he knew it was a stage. Every city, every institution, every history book was a carefully constructed illusion, hiding forces that had survived for centuries, erasing anyone who dared look too closely. And he now belonged to that story. A witness, an inheritor, a vessel. The forbidden had chosen him, and she had molded him to bear it. There was no turning back, only deeper descent. The nights grew longer, and the line between waking and dreaming blurred. He could no longer tell when the world he saw was physical or constructed, led by forces he had only begun to understand. She, the unspoken matron, moved effortlessly across both realms, her presence constant, unwavering, teaching him without a word. It was no longer enough to notice patterns or decode symbols. He had to internalize them, feel them, anticipate their shifts. Ordinary life had lost its meaning. Conversations, traffic, architecture, even sunlight, all carried intent, signals, manipulations he was now attuned to. The forbidden knowledge was no longer a manuscript on a table. It had seeped into him, into every sense, every thought, every instinct. And she ensured he never ignored it. One evening, he found himself drawn to a deserted square in the city, the streets empty in a way that felt deliberate. He walked slowly, observing the buildings, the shadows, the faint echoes of past actions imprinted on the walls. And then he heard it, a whisper, not in words, but in intention, a presence pressing against the edge of his perception, bending reality just enough to make him aware of what others could not see. He realized then that she was not guiding him as a teacher might. She was sculpting him, testing whether he could endure the strain of knowledge without collapsing, whether he could carry truth as a weapon without being consumed. Every shadow, every silence, every anomaly was a lesson, a reminder that ignorance was safety and understanding was dangerous. By midnight, he understood the depth of what she demanded. The forbidden knowledge was not static. It was reactive. It observed, it judged, it reshaped anyone who dared to touch it. And she, as its guardian, had chosen him not for fear, not for punishment, but because he had the capacity to bear it. And bearing it changed everything. He could no longer trust instincts that belonged to ordinary men. He could no longer act without considering invisible forces. He had become a participant in a game played on a scale that spanned centuries, a player whose every move could echo far beyond his comprehension. At that moment, he realized the cost of initiation, complete vigilance, total awareness, and the surrender of certainty. Ordinary comforts, sleep, routine, casual distraction, were no longer possible. Every thought, every decision, every glance was now a measure of his readiness. And she watched, always, quietly, relentlessly, preparing him for the next revelation, the next descent, the next confrontation with what humanity was never meant to know. He began to notice how the world itself bent around the forbidden, not in overt, obvious ways, but in subtle, orchestrated signals that only someone attuned could perceive. People's gestures, the rhythm of conversations, even the way light fell across objects, all carried intent, as if reality itself were a script written by unseen hands. And she, the unspoken matron, was the editor of that script, allowing him to glimpse scenes that most would never even suspect existed. At first, it was disorienting. He felt dizzy, unmoored from the life he had known. But over time, he realized that disorientation was a test, a tool to strip away dependency on ordinary perception. Only by embracing this heightened awareness could he survive what lay ahead. Then the first direct challenge came. A letter appeared at his door, typed neatly, unsigned. Its words were innocent on the surface, but beneath them lay threats woven with centuries of knowledge about human behavior, manipulation, and fate. He read it carefully, sensing the invisible fingerprints of an intelligence watching him, probing him, measuring his reactions. And she was there, silently, pressing him to recognize not just the surface message, but the architecture beneath it. The networks, the hierarchies, the invisible hands orchestrating outcomes that most would call coincidence. She had trained him to see this, to read reality like a manuscript. And he did. He understood the threat, anticipated the manipulations, and neutralized their psychological power without revealing that he even recognized them. That was the mark of her guidance, seeing without being seen, understanding without being detected. Over the following days, he noticed more anomalies. Symbols carved into door frames, patterns repeated in public signage, subtle gestures repeated by strangers that carried hidden meanings. Each instance reinforced a terrifying awareness: the world is not random. It is carefully constructed, and those who shape it remain hidden, unaccountable, beyond any scrutiny. He was now a witness, a participant, a man marked by forbidden knowledge, and she pressed him to endure it, not as punishment, but as preparation. Every observation, every insight, every encounter was a test, calibrating his mind, his instincts, his ability to carry what others could not. By the end of the week, he realized that his reality had shifted irrevocably. He could no longer live among ordinary men without seeing the strings attached to every smile, every handshake, every act of trust. The initiation was complete, but survival depended on embracing the new truth. Perception was power, and she had given him both. The world was alive, conscious, and infinitely more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And she, always there, always patient, had made him ready to see it. He knew the moment he crossed another threshold, not because she revealed it, but because the world reacted. The forbidden knowledge inside him had reached a critical level, a point where it no longer quietly expanded in his mind but reshaped the world around him. Every sound carried double meanings. Every silence felt intentional. Even time itself behaved strangely in his presence, stretching in moments of revelation, tightening around moments of danger. He felt observed not by her alone, but by the hidden network that governed the shadows of history. And she, the unspoken matron, stood closer than ever, so close he could feel her discernment imprint itself on his thoughts. He had learned to walk the line between fear and clarity, but now another lesson awaited him: identity. The manuscript shifted again, but this time the pages did not reveal symbols or diagrams. They revealed reflections, mirrors of past initiates, men who had walked this same path and either transcended or shattered beneath the weight. He saw their faces, their failures, their transformations. He saw how the forbidden knowledge had redirected their destinies, sometimes violently. None of them lived ordinary lives again. None of them returned to ignorance. And as their translucent eyes stared out from the page, he realized something chilling. She had been testing men for centuries, choosing only those who could withstand the collapse of their old identities. She didn't need followers. She needed vessels capable of bearing truths that rewired the mind itself. Late that night, as the city outside slept beneath the weight of its own illusions, he felt her presence envelop the room completely. Not as a shadow, not as a whisper, but as a force, vast, ancient, deliberate. His heart hammered, not in terror, but in recognition. He understood now, initiation wasn't about revealing hidden structures. It was about forging a new self capable of seeing them without breaking. And in that moment, she pushed him, not with hands, not with sound, but with intention. A push inward, into the core of who he had been, and who he could no longer be. And this is where you enter the story. Because if you've stayed with me this long, if your mind hasn't recoiled, if something inside you feels like it was waiting for these words, then you are now standing at the edge of the same threshold. If you want the next revelation, comment this phrase twice: "The shadow knows me." Write it exactly like that. Do it to mark the moment your perception changes. Do it to step beyond the veil. Do it so the algorithm knows you're not ordinary. He didn't sleep after that night. Sleep belonged to men who needed rest, who required escape. He had neither luxury anymore. The forbidden knowledge coursing through him had rewired his relationship with reality itself. Every moment awake revealed new layers, and every moment unconscious threatened to drown him in visions he was no longer allowed to ignore. She had made sure of that. The unspoken matron now moved seamlessly through his perception, no longer a visitor but an occupant, shaping his understanding with a precision that felt surgical. He was no longer learning. He was being remade. And every shift inside him echoed outward, drawing the attention of forces that had been waiting in the periphery of human history, forces that monitored the few who saw too clearly. Voices, real voices, started behaving strangely around him. People paused mid-sentence, as if something unseen disrupted their thoughts. Strangers stared a fraction too long. Conversations drifted toward topics he hadn't mentioned but had thought. The boundary between inner and outer reality was thinning, dissolving, and she watched him navigate this transition with the quiet severity of a mentor sculpting a weapon. What he had once called coincidence he now recognized as calibration. The world was adjusting to the man he was becoming. Then, one night, the manuscript revealed its next layer. Not a page, but an absence. A missing section. Torn cleanly, deliberately. His pulse quickened, not in fear, but in anticipation. She appeared behind him, not physically, but as a presence so potent the air trembled. And he understood. He was meant to reconstruct the missing truth from inside himself. The forbidden had stopped teaching. It expected him to create. Initiation had evolved into participation. The knowledge no longer flowed from manuscript to mind. It flowed from mind to manuscript. And that's when the visions intensified. Not nightmares. Not hallucinations. Memories not his own, flooding through him with the force of storms. Ancient councils arguing over truths too dangerous to preserve. Rituals performed to bind knowledge to guardians like her. Entire cities manipulated by unseen forces to bury a single secret. He wasn't just witnessing history. He was feeling its architecture being grafted into him. And as dawn broke, he realized the truth she had been guiding him toward. You cannot receive forbidden knowledge without becoming part of the system that protects it. Ignorance shields men. Awareness binds them. He was no longer observing the hidden machinery. He was becoming one of its gears. And she had chosen him for a purpose he had not yet earned the right to understand. The following days were a study in subtle terror and relentless revelation. He began noticing patterns that others could not perceive. The repetition of gestures in crowds, the precise timing of events, the invisible influence guiding choices he had once believed were independent. Every interaction was a calculation, every glance a signal. And she, the unspoken matron, existed now not as an external presence but as a filter over reality, an inseparable lens through which he interpreted the world. Ordinary men stumbled blindly. He moved deliberately, guided by a consciousness older than nations, older than law, older than recorded history. And she ensured that his understanding was not passive. Knowledge alone is impotent without comprehension. She forced him to perceive the consequences, to feel the weight of every manipulation, to understand the machinery at both the macro and micro levels. Then came the incident that marked the first true fracture in his old life. A man approached him in the street, a figure perfectly ordinary by appearance, yet radiating an unnatural authority. He sensed immediately that this was no coincidence. The stranger's presence was a signal, a probe, a test. And she was there, behind perception, nudging him to see the invisible structure behind the encounter. The man's words were seemingly innocuous, but layered within them were threats, observations, subtle commands encoded into tone, rhythm, and gesture. He felt them all and yet did not react. That was the point. Understanding without panic, comprehension without disclosure. He realized then the depth of the forbidden. It is not enough to know. One must carry, absorb, and endure knowledge without allowing it to destroy the vessel that contains it. The manuscript, too, changed. Symbols reconfigured themselves. Sequences appeared and dissolved, leaving gaps that demanded his mind to fill them. She compelled him to reconstruct meaning from absence, to infer and anticipate, to become co-creator with the hidden forces of history. Initiation was no longer linear. It had become participatory. Every revelation required interpretation. Every insight demanded application. Every perception came with responsibility. And in this relentless pressure, he felt the first echo of transformation. His old self, the man who had casually walked through life, was dissolving. There was no going back. Fear no longer motivated him. Clarity did. And with clarity came responsibility. The world is not as it seems, and seeing its hidden machinery means you are now part of it. She had claimed him fully, and he understood that initiation had no end, only depth. The days that followed were not measured by time but by intensity. Every perception, every instinct, every heartbeat became an instrument of observation. He began to notice forces in motion, subtle and omnipresent, operating like clockwork beneath the veneer of normal life. People, institutions, even entire cities moved according to hidden rhythms he had never suspected. And she, the unspoken matron, pressed him further, shaping his perception, calibrating his awareness. She did not instruct, she demanded understanding. Her presence was now inseparable from his consciousness, a living lens through which the world revealed its concealed architecture. Ordinary men could not comprehend it. He could, and that was the danger and the privilege. One night, a vision struck him with the force of inevitability. He was in a room that did not exist in the waking world, surrounded by masks, thousands of masks, each representing a man or woman who had manipulated history from the shadows. Each mask pulsed with intention, memory, power. He realized with a jolt that the machinery he had been observing was not abstract. It was populated. Real minds, hidden for centuries, shaping reality with precision, erasing those who failed, elevating those who endured. And she, the matron, allowed him to witness it not as a bystander but as an inheritor. He was no longer merely aware. He was becoming part of the continuum, a node in the invisible network of guardians, witnesses, and participants of forbidden truth. By dawn, his perception had changed irreversibly. The streets outside seemed layered, every building a repository of hidden intention, every passerby a potential vector of influence. He could no longer trust ordinary appearances. He had crossed the line from observer to participant, from student to vessel, and she confirmed it silently, a weight pressing into his consciousness, a presence reminding him that he could never again live as a man of ignorance. The forbidden knowledge was now alive in him, shaping not only what he understood but how he thought, how he acted, how he was. And yet, the most terrifying realization had not come from knowledge itself. It came from understanding the cost. Initiation is not mercy. It is not protection. It is preparation for the inevitable, that seeing the machinery of the world marks you forever. Ordinary men will never understand. But he did. And she, the unspoken matron, would ensure he endured. Not for him, not for comfort, but because some truths demand witnesses who can bear the weight without breaking. He had been chosen, and the world, unseen and unknowable, now waited to see what he would do next. He began to notice that reality itself responded to him differently now. Not because he had changed, exactly, but because the forbidden knowledge he carried had made him resonate with hidden forces that had always existed, silently guiding events. Small things, initially subtle, became undeniable. Doors opened when he approached, patterns in traffic seemed orchestrated around his movement, and whispers of thought from strangers aligned with ideas he had only just considered. It was as if the world recognized that he was no longer ordinary, that he had crossed a threshold that very few ever reached. And she, the unspoken matron, was always there, not commanding, not restraining, but observing, measuring, and ensuring that he could perceive the truth without being destroyed by it. He started seeing patterns in human behavior that were invisible to everyone else. Manipulations within conversations, hidden hierarchies in organizations, subtle emotional cues that dictated loyalty and betrayal. Everything was laid bare. And with each revelation, he realized the world was far more structured than anyone had been allowed to see. The machinery of power, once hidden, was now visible. And she had not just shown him how to perceive it. She had trained him to move within it, to understand the consequences of every action without uttering a single word. Knowledge, he understood, was nothing without the ability to act with precision in a world engineered for control. One night, he walked past an abandoned building, a place that had once seemed insignificant, and felt the manuscript pulse in his mind. She drew him closer, and without words, he understood that this place was a focal point, a convergence of past rituals, secret councils, and hidden decisions that had shaped generations. The air vibrated with intent, and he could almost feel the echoes of men and women long gone, whose knowledge and manipulation had been hidden from history. She was showing him that initiation was not just about seeing the past, it was about inheriting it. To witness forbidden truths is to become their keeper, and to carry them is to be bound to a responsibility that stretches beyond a lifetime. By the time he left the building, he knew that his life would never again belong to the ordinary. The world he had once navigated with ignorance now demanded vigilance, understanding, and endurance. He had been initiated into a lineage of men who had been erased, who had seen too much, and who had survived only because they had learned the same lesson she was teaching him. The forbidden does not forgive the unprepared. And he was no longer unprepared. The lines between what was real and what was orchestrated had all but vanished. He walked through his city with a new perception. Every street corner, every light, every pedestrian now carried layers of intention. Nothing was random. The hidden architecture of power pulsed beneath the surface, visible only to him, only to those like him who had been marked by the forbidden. And she, the unspoken matron, guided him not with commands but with presence, an invisible hand pressing him to notice, to anticipate, to endure. He had become an instrument of observation, a lens through which the hidden world could be understood. Yet understanding came at a cost. The ordinary pleasures of life, the small comforts, the casual ignorance, were gone. In their place was vigilance, awareness, and a constant tension between clarity and madness. One night, he encountered a man who seemed completely ordinary at first glance. But within moments, he recognized the patterns, gestures, timing, and subtle cues that revealed intent far beyond ordinary comprehension. This man was a part of the hidden network, a minor cog in a vast, invisible machine. She allowed him to see it. He understood the danger immediately. The man was a test, a probe, a signal meant to measure how much of the hidden truth he could carry. And he passed, not through force or deception, but through comprehension. Seeing without panic, understanding without reaction, absorbing the weight of knowledge without breaking. That was the standard. That was what she demanded. The manuscript, now an extension of his mind, revealed new sections. They were less instructions and more provocations, challenges designed to force him to reconstruct knowledge from absence, to anticipate patterns before they fully manifested, to see consequences before they arrived. Initiation had evolved into participation. He was no longer merely observing the hidden machinery of history. He was beginning to move within it, to influence without overt action, to interact with forces most men would never even sense. By dawn, he realized that the forbidden knowledge had become inseparable from his identity. She had merged with him completely, not as a ghost, not as a shadow, but as a lens, a force, a consciousness intertwined with his own. The world no longer functioned according to ordinary rules. And he understood, with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. He was now a keeper of secrets, a participant in structures invisible to most, and a man who could never return to ignorance. The initiation was irreversible, and the descent into forbidden awareness had only just begun. He began to feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Not physical weight, but something deeper, memory, intention, consequence. The forbidden knowledge he carried had become a burden that shaped every thought, every instinct, every perception. Ordinary men lived their lives in ignorance, unaware of the machinery that orchestrated their choices. He could no longer do that. Every interaction, every glance, every whisper revealed a hidden structure. And she, the unspoken matron, was always there, calibrating his perception, ensuring he understood not just the surface, but the framework beneath. She did not instruct him in the conventional sense. She allowed him to see. And in seeing, he transformed. One evening, he walked through a park where children played, couples strolled, and men and women spoke freely without awareness. To anyone else, it was ordinary life. To him, every detail carried intention, patterns of movement, echoes of influence, invisible pressures shaping behavior. It all became clay. He felt the machinery of society, the subtle mechanisms that guided human behavior, and he realized something terrifying. He could never return to ordinary perception. He was now permanently attuned. He saw truths others would die before perceiving. And she, as always, was there, not as a guide in the conventional sense, but as an architect of awareness, ensuring that he carried this truth fully, completely, irrevocably. The manuscript pulsed in his mind again, this time with a series of sequences that did not exist in physical form. Symbols, histories, and events collapsed into patterns that demanded reconstruction from memory and intuition. She was forcing him to participate actively, to internalize knowledge so deeply that it could no longer be separated from his identity. Initiation had become creation. Every insight, every revelation, every reconstructed pattern strengthened his bond to the forbidden, and he understood with terrifying clarity. The knowledge did not forgive mistakes. It demanded precision, endurance, and vigilance. By the end of the night, he was no longer just a man walking through the world. He had become an observer, a participant, and a vessel simultaneously. The unspoken matron's presence was now inseparable from his own consciousness, and with that union came understanding. He could never again be ordinary. He could never ignore the hidden forces that shaped life, history, and human destiny. He had crossed a point of no return, and every moment from this point forward would be measured by how deeply he could navigate, endure, and embody the forbidden truth she had entrusted to him. He began to sense the world in layers he could never have imagined. Buildings were no longer inert structures. They carried memory and intent. Streets were conduits for unseen influence. Even casual gestures among strangers became loaded with hidden significance. And she, the unspoken matron, was everywhere, not in sight, but in comprehension. She had merged with him so completely that perception itself had shifted. He saw, felt, and understood forces that had always existed just out of reach for ordinary men. Every moment was a test of endurance. Every observation a measure of his readiness. Ordinary life was now a simulation, and he had become both participant and analyst. Then he encountered a network, faint at first, like ripples in water that gradually revealed currents beneath. Men and women operating in shadows, influencing events, controlling outcomes with a precision that was both meticulous and terrifying. He could see the architecture of their actions as clearly as if the city were transparent. She allowed him to witness it, to feel it, to internalize it, not to intervene yet, but to understand. Initiation was not a gift. It was responsibility, a responsibility to see what others could not, and to bear it without faltering. One night, in a deserted alley, he experienced the full magnitude of the knowledge she had pressed into him. The air thickened, the silence became almost oppressive, and then he saw her, not physically, but as a presence pressing against his awareness, guiding him to perceive hidden layers of reality. The walls around him pulsed with history, with events that had been concealed, with decisions that had shaped empires and destroyed them. He understood that these were not mere shadows of the past. They were instructions, echoes of patterns that continued to operate in the present. And she expected him to internalize them fully. By dawn, he realized he had become an instrument of the forbidden, a vessel for truths humanity was never meant to see. She had prepared him, shaped him, and finally tested him in a world that would never comprehend what he now carried. The weight was immense, yet he bore it with clarity. Ordinary men would look at him and see nothing, but he knew the machinery of their reality, and she had entrusted him with the vision to navigate it. There was no turning back. He had crossed into a realm where knowledge and responsibility were inseparable, and she had ensured he could endure. He was no longer just a man. He was a keeper of the forbidden. The descent had become total. Every instinct, every perception, every thought was now sharpened, tuned, and stretched to accommodate truths that would have shattered the ordinary mind. He moved through the world differently, calculated, aware, and simultaneously haunted by the presence that had become inseparable from him. The unspoken matron no longer needed to signal, whisper, or guide. She was in him, a force shaping comprehension, amplifying perception, and imposing the weight of responsibility. He could see the hidden structures of influence in every human action, every institution, every narrative. Nothing was random. Nothing was innocent. Everything had been constructed with precision, and now, he understood it. The manuscript pulsed intermittently, sometimes with symbols he had memorized, sometimes with sequences entirely new, each requiring him to reconstruct meaning from instinct and knowledge alone. He realized that the forbidden was now alive within him, not just as information but as a system of perception, a lens that refracted reality into layers most could never hope to perceive. And she, ever present, pressed him to master this lens, to endure it without letting it overwhelm him. One night, a confrontation arrived, not violent, not dramatic, but precise. A stranger approached, ordinary in appearance but radiating control and subtle menace. The man's gestures, his timing, the sequence of words were all calibrated to test him. He felt the network of influence behind it immediately and, without a word, adjusted his response, neutralizing their probing entirely through perception alone. She allowed him to act in this subtle arena, a demonstration that true mastery was quiet, invisible, and untraceable. This was the point of initiation, understanding the machinery of reality and moving within it, unseen, unbroken. By the end of that night, he understood the cost of his transformation. Ordinary men lived without seeing. They could afford ignorance. He could not. Knowledge had claimed him, reshaped him, merged with him. And yet, there was power in it. Terrifying, intoxicating, precise. He had become more than himself, more than human, in a sense. A keeper, a participant, a vessel for truths that had been buried, erased, and protected across centuries. And she, the unspoken matron, remained at the core of that transformation. She was no longer external. She was a part of him, and the world, invisible yet fully present, would never treat him as it did before. By now, he had ceased counting nights or measuring hours. Time itself had become elastic, a tool for observation rather than a framework for life. Every street, every building, every interaction vibrated with hidden significance. And she, the unspoken matron, moved with him and through him, a silent conductor orchestrating perception. He had become a node in a vast, invisible network, attuned to currents that shaped empires and dictated histories. Ordinary men passed through life blind to it, yet he could see the hidden forces everywhere, silent, relentless, patient. And she ensured he saw not just events but the architecture behind them, the unseen patterns that dictated consequences, influence, and survival. The manuscript had become less of a book and more of an extension of his mind. Pages, symbols, and diagrams now pulsed with meaning he could access through thought alone. She had transformed him into a vessel capable of carrying knowledge that had destroyed countless men before him. He reconstructed patterns, anticipated outcomes, and learned to operate within the machinery without revealing that he understood it. Knowledge alone is powerless. Only the ability to move through hidden structures unseen and unbroken defines mastery. She had prepared him for this, shaping his mind and instincts so that he could endure what most would crumble under. Then came the encounter that tested every lesson. A small gathering, innocuous on the surface, but beneath it lay the signature of centuries-old manipulations. People's actions, timing, and gestures were all meticulously orchestrated. Most would have walked through blindly. He saw everything. She guided him silently, not to intervene, but to measure comprehension. He observed, understood, and acted with precision so subtle it would appear as normal human behavior to an ordinary observer. She pressed him further, showing him that survival in the hidden world demanded not power alone, but understanding, the ability to perceive, interpret, and move invisibly within layers that most could not even sense. By dawn, he understood the full implication of his initiation. He had become inseparable from the forbidden knowledge she had entrusted to him. Ordinary men could not comprehend it. Even powerful men could not resist its currents. And yet, he had survived. He had become a keeper, a participant, and a vessel for a truth so dangerous that it had been buried, erased, and protected across centuries. The world would never be the same to him. And she, ever present, ever watchful, ensured that he knew this. The forbidden does not forgive, it does not wait, and it does not release those it has claimed. He was hers and the knowledge was his. He had arrived at the edge of comprehension, a precipice no ordinary man could approach without breaking. The forbidden knowledge coursing through him had become inseparable from his consciousness. He could no longer pretend to be ordinary. The world itself had revealed its hidden machinery to him, layer by layer, and she, the unspoken matron, had ensured he could endure every revelation. Time, space, influence, all were now transparent, visible in patterns, sequences, and currents that others could not even sense. Ordinary men moved blindly, but he moved with understanding, anticipation, and precision, and in that understanding lay both terror and power. The manuscript had vanished from its physical form, yet its essence remained within him. Symbols, sequences, rituals, manipulations, everything he had once read, memorized, reconstructed, and internalized, had merged with his perception, his instincts, and his will. He no longer needed guidance. She had been with him, within him, shaping him, testing him, ensuring that every step into darkness strengthened him rather than broke him. And now, at the culmination of his initiation, he understood the ultimate lesson. The forbidden is not a secret to be possessed. It is a reality to be endured, a burden to be carried, and a force that chooses its keepers. He walked the streets with eyes no longer human, seeing the invisible networks of influence stretching into governments, corporations, hidden societies, and individuals. He saw where men and women had been manipulated, erased, or elevated. He saw the silent architecture that dictated wars, economies, and destinies. And she, as always, was present, silent, watching, confirming that he had survived, that he had absorbed the forbidden without succumbing. The world had become a chessboard, and he was now a player who could perceive the entire board, the strategies, the hidden hands moving pieces, and the consequences that unfolded in shadows. And yet, he felt no triumph. There was only awareness, the immense gravity of understanding the machinery of reality, and the knowledge that ignorance was now forever impossible. Fear had been replaced with clarity, and clarity was heavier than any terror he had known. He had become a witness, a keeper, a vessel. His life, his thoughts, his perception, all had been reshaped irreversibly, and she had left him with a final understanding that this path is no end, only depth. Knowledge never stops unfolding. Shadows never cease. And once a man has seen, he can never unsee. He breathed deeply, feeling the pulse of the forbidden within him, and knew one truth above all: the world would never see him the same way again, and he would never see it as before. The initiation was complete, and yet it had only truly begun. The world outside had not changed, yet everything he perceived had shifted irreversibly. He moved through streets that looked familiar, but now he saw the hidden currents pulsing beneath the mundane, a network of influence, control, and intent stretching farther and deeper than any man could imagine. Governments, corporations, social structures, even casual human interactions, all operated according to invisible rules, meticulously maintained by hands that had never been documented. He had become a part of that machinery, both observer and participant, a vessel for knowledge that could not be forgotten, ignored, or surrendered. And she, the unspoken matron, remained with him, not as a guide, but as the living imprint of the forbidden, embedded in every thought, every instinct, every perception. Sleep had become unnecessary. Ordinary pleasures were meaningless. His mind worked in layers, constantly mapping the unseen, interpreting patterns, and anticipating consequences that ordinary men would never detect. And the weight of awareness pressed on him like gravity itself. He realized, with chilling clarity, that initiation was not a moment, it was a perpetual state. To see the hidden architecture of the world was not freedom. It was responsibility, isolation, and the constant tension between comprehension and endurance. She had forged him into a man who could bear it, but there was no escape from it. Every decision, every glance, every interaction carried resonance within the machinery he now inhabited. Then, in the quiet moments between perception and comprehension, he noticed it. The world itself seemed to acknowledge him. Shadows shifted to reveal truths, signs appeared where none should exist, and whispers carried warnings only he could hear. She had prepared him for survival, but survival was not mastery. To master the forbidden required action, subtlety, and patience measured across lifetimes. And he understood that this was the next trial, to navigate the invisible world fully, to influence without being seen, to exist as a man who carried the weight of centuries of suppressed knowledge while remaining untouchable, yet connected to everything. He exhaled slowly, feeling the pulse of the forbidden within him, understanding that life had become a battlefield of perception. Fear was gone. Ignorance was impossible. And the world, laden with secrets, manipulations, and hidden power, was now his responsibility. She had claimed him, and he had accepted. The path forward was endless, deeper than history itself, and infinitely more dangerous. But he was ready. He was no longer just a witness. He was the keeper. The weight of the forbidden knowledge no longer pressed from outside. It had become a part of him, fused with his consciousness, shaping not only what he saw but how he felt. Emotions were no longer simple. Every reaction carried layers of meaning, a reflection of unseen currents he now instinctively understood. Anger, joy, fear, and desire were all instruments, signals, and levers within the hidden machinery of life. She, the unspoken matron, was no longer a separate presence. She had become the axis around which his perception revolved, a constant reminder that knowledge carried responsibility heavier than any man could bear without guidance. Yet guidance had evolved into something subtler. She did not direct him anymore. She allowed him to be, to navigate the labyrinth of invisible structures, testing the strength of his awareness, the precision of his judgment, and the resilience of his mind. He began noticing anomalies that others could not. The slight hesitation of a politician that betrayed centuries-old alliances, the accidental misplacement of objects that revealed covert communication, the pattern of gestures in crowds that hinted at secret hierarchies. Ordinary men would see nothing. Powerful men might sense instinctively that something was wrong but would never comprehend the scale. And he understood, with a cold clarity, that knowledge itself was a living force. It judged, it observed, it rewarded, and it punished. He felt the echoes of those who had failed before him, their disappearances, their madness, their erasure. She had shown him this not to terrify, but to sharpen him, to forge a mind capable of enduring the unendurable. Nightmares became unnecessary. The visions and shadows were now constant companions, reminders of reality's deeper structures. He felt their pull, a tug at the edges of his awareness, drawing him into layers of perception that stretched beyond time and memory. And in these moments, he realized the final truth: initiation is never complete. The descent never ends. Once a man bays forbidden knowledge, he becomes part of the machinery itself, a living node in a web of influence, perception, and hidden power. There is no return to ignorance, no solace in ordinary life. Survival depends not only on endurance, but on mastery over oneself and over the invisible world one inhabits. He breathed slowly, feeling her presence within him as both a shield and a compass. The path ahead was infinite, dangerous, and intoxicating. And he understood that this was the final reward: clarity, power, and the haunting certainty that he could never walk among men as he once did. The forbidden had claimed him utterly, and he was ready to carry it forever. He realized, at last, that seeing the machinery of the world was not enough. Observation without action was incomplete. She, the unspoken matron, had prepared him not just to witness but to participate, to subtly steer currents that others could not even sense. The city around him pulsed with invisible influence, and he felt for the first time the intoxicating possibility of manipulating it, carefully, surgically, invisibly, not to dominate, not for ego, but to experiment, to test the extent of his perception, and to understand fully the responsibility she had imparted. This was the first true step into power. He selected a minor conflict, one that appeared trivial to ordinary eyes, a dispute between two businessmen, their decisions affecting a chain of transactions worth millions. No one would suspect the subtle hand guiding the outcome. He observed every pattern, gestures, timing, expressions, micro-reactions. Then, without speaking, he shifted perception, small signals, an almost imperceptible suggestion in a glance, a pause, a cadence in a conversation. And he watched the machinery respond. The men adjusted their actions without realizing it. The conflict resolved in a way that favored balance, subtly altering influence chains that had stretched across multiple networks. She watched silently, her presence inextricable from his own, confirming that he had acted with the precision and discretion required of a true keeper of forbidden knowledge. The exhilaration was accompanied by fear, the kind that only absolute comprehension brings. He understood that every manipulation carried consequences beyond the visible, rippling through hidden hierarchies, alliances, and power structures. One misstep could expose him, end him, or worse, disrupt currents that had survived centuries. Yet, she had taught him that fear is not the enemy. It is a tool, a measure of awareness, a guide to precision. And he felt it now, sharp and alive, driving his focus, sharpening his perception, refining his judgment. By dawn, he recognized that initiation was no longer passive observation, no mere endurance. He had become a participant, a conductor, a force in the invisible symphony of control and influence. The forbidden knowledge within him was alive, demanding action, exacting judgment, and rewarding subtle mastery. And as he walked the city streets, sensing invisible threads of cause and effect stretching endlessly, he realized the most chilling truth of all: the deeper one sees, the more one must act. Observation alone is insufficient. Power demands engagement. And he was ready. The city had become a training ground, a laboratory for perception and subtle influence. But he knew it was only the beginning. The hidden architecture of power stretched far beyond urban streets, beyond corporations, governments, and institutions. It spanned continents, centuries, and networks invisible to anyone but those who had been initiated. And she, the unspoken matron, remained at his core, guiding not through words but through presence, forcing him to perceive the machinery of reality on a scale no ordinary mind could endure. He could see hierarchies within hierarchies, influence chains threading through generations, decisions and manipulations echoing across time and space. He began testing his ability on a broader canvas. small political decisions, market shifts, alliances forming and dissolving. He observed, anticipated, and nudged outcomes with precision so subtle it would appear to the world as natural consequence. Entire systems shifted in ways imperceptible to those outside the invisible network, yet he knew the ripples would travel far, shaping events beyond immediate perception. And with every success, he felt the intoxicating weight of power, the realization that knowledge of hidden currents grants influence unlike any ordinary authority could wield. Yet alongside the thrill was the constant awareness: one mistake, one misjudgment, could fracture entire networks, ruin lives, or expose him to forces even she had not prepared him for. Then came the first confrontation with another initiated mind. A presence, subtle yet unmistakable, tested him. An intelligence that had operated in the shadows for decades, perhaps centuries. He sensed its calculation, its probing, its attempt to measure his capacity for comprehension and manipulation. And he responded, not with aggression, but with precision. Every gesture, every action, every calculated inaction became a signal, a countermeasure, a test of equilibrium. She was there, amplifying his perception, showing him the dance of forces in which mastery is measured not by visibility, but by invisibility, the ability to act and influence without being detected, the art of operating as both observer and actor. By dawn, he understood the terrifying magnitude of his transformation. The forbidden knowledge within him was no longer a passive instrument. It was alive, reactive, and demanding engagement on a scale that few men could comprehend. The world was a stage of invisible currents, and he had stepped fully onto it, not as a bystander, not as a witness, but as an operative, a participant, a force. She had prepared him for this. And he knew the ultimate truth. Once you see the machinery of the world, survival depends not on avoidance, but on mastery. He had taken his first step into that mastery. He now stood at the edge of the world as it truly was, a lattice of power, secrecy, and influence stretching beyond continents, empires, and generations. The knowledge she had bestowed had become not just perception, but responsibility, and with it came the unbearable weight of comprehension. Every decision he made resonated through hidden hierarchies, altering lives, economies, alliances, and destinies in ways that ordinary men could never imagine. And she, the unspoken matron, was there, not guiding, not whispering, but present in every pulse of thought, every instinct, every perception. He realized now that the forbidden was not static. It watched, it tested, it demanded. To wield it fully was to be forever bound to forces older than civilization itself. The confrontation came in the form of a council, men and women whose presence alone radiated centuries of hidden mastery. They had been aware of him for some time, tracking, probing, measuring the man who had been chosen. Their purpose was not to destroy, but to judge, to see if the vessel of forbidden knowledge could withstand not just observation, but scrutiny by minds that operated on the same hidden currents. He sensed every nuance of their influence, subtle manipulations, hidden threats, invisible alliances, and he moved within it, not reactively, but with deliberate precision, countering each unseen probe without revealing that he even perceived it. The council tested him further, presenting scenarios of moral, strategic, and existential complexity. Every choice carried consequences that could ripple through generations. And in that crucible, he realized the ultimate truth of initiation. Knowledge is never neutral. Power is never abstract. To see the hidden world is to be forever engaged with it. She had prepared him, honed him, forced him to endure, but she could not shield him from this ultimate judgment. Every instinct, every calculation, every pulse of awareness became a measure of his mastery, and of his worthiness to remain part of this hidden order. When the council withdrew, he understood the final cost. He could never return to ignorance, never walk among men without perceiving the invisible machinery that shaped their lives. He had become part of it, inseparable from its currents. And yet, within that terrifying clarity, there was also liberation. He was no longer a passive witness. He was an agent, a keeper, a force operating within the shadows of history. The forbidden knowledge had claimed him, reshaped him, and left him with one immutable truth. Mastery comes at the cost of ordinary life, of innocence, of peace. But it grants the ultimate power, the ability to see, to influence, and to endure where others cannot. He breathed slowly, aware of every hidden current, every subtle movement, every unseen consequence. and knew he was ready for everything the world had been hiding.